Hi, I'm Doug Rathbone, and today I'm going to give you a brief introduction to OnCheckin. OnCheckin is a continuous deployment service for ASP.NET developers that allows you to easily build and deploy your websites directly to your web server simply by checking into source control. Setting up automated build and deployment environments can be time-consuming and complicated. OnCheckin aims to simplify this, so all you need to do is point it at your source control and your web server, and OnCheckin takes care of the rest. To begin, I'm going to use a sample MVC website solution. It contains 3 projects. One project for our website, one project for our business logic, and another for our unit tests. You'll also notice inside our website there's a convention-based web.config file transform called web.oncheckin.config. This file is a standard web config transform file. Inside, I put my environmental settings that OnCheckin will apply to my web config before it deploys my site. My sample includes a database connection string and the SMTP details required for my site to run properly on my web host. If we run this site and take a look at it, you'll notice that it's pretty basic. It's a simple one-page app that takes 2 numbers and adds them together when I press this button. To start my OnCheckin setup, I'm going to push my site to a Bitbucket Git repository that I've just created. I'm using SourceTree for Windows, but you could use any Git client you like. This is our first look at the OnCheckin Deployment Manager, and as you can see, my account's pretty bare. I've just signed up, so there isn't much to see here, as I need to set up a deployment project first. So let's go do that now. The first thing you'll notice on the new project configuration page is that OnCheckin asks for you to provide access credentials to your source control. We currently support GitHub and Bitbucket, private SVN, private Git, and Team Foundation server. We recommend that you create a separate set of account credentials in your source control so that you can control and audit OnCheckin access separately. With Bitbucket and GitHub users, you don't need to enter user credentials and can give us access using OAuth, making it really easy to connect that Bitbucket repository that I just pushed my project to. Since connecting my source control, OnCheckin needs to now successfully test that it can connect to Bitbucket, and I can make this happen by clicking this button. What this does is it gets OnCheckin to try and connect to my source control and download any revision history. As this came back successfully, we now move on to setting up my deployment. Here I enter a few things. First, the name of the website project I'd like to deploy. This is my Visual Studio project name as shown in the Solution Explorer. You'll remember I named this oncheckinexample.website. Next, I select whether I'd like my unit tests to break the build and stop deployment if they fail. This is useful if I have unit tests that have dependencies that only exist in my local environment. Then I can do a couple of things. I can either enter my server's deployment method and credentials, or I can drag and drop a publishing profile that my web hosting provider has given me. Today I'm deploying to Azure, so I'm going to shift over to my Azure portal and download a publishing profile. Then I simply upload this file to OnCheckin, and the service sets up my deployment credentials for me. The next step is just like my source control. I need to have OnCheckin validate that it can connect to my web hosting company. OnCheckin goes away and tries to connect to my web server. It then attempts to list the files in my website's directory, upload a temporary text file, and then delete this file, all to validate that it can successfully deploy my website. Now that I'm done, I can move over to the Review tab. Here I can tell OnCheckin to test that my website has deployed successfully by entering its URL. I can also tell OnCheckin to run a safer web scan when it's done. But I'm going to save my deployment project because there's no more information required to get going. Back at my deployment manager, you can now see that my new project has been successfully set up, and I can move on to my first deployment by manually running it using the run link shown next to my project name. And here is where OnCheckin then launches into action. It then goes off and downloads my project's source code, builds it, runs any of my unit tests, runs a security scan against my web config file, then finally deploys my website to my web host. You can see here that the deployment console surfaces the current deployment progress and shows me where my deployment is up to. As my project's begun deploying, I can switch over to its URL. You'll see that OnCheckin has put up a holding page for my website visitors to let them know that my website is being deployed. This page is also customizable. If I switch back over to Azure, you can now see that my website is online. Before we move on any further, it's worth taking a closer look at the result of my deployment run and reviewing any build logs, unit test results, and both web config and active security scan results. This is where you would go if you needed to investigate any build or deployment issues you're having, as it'll make it a lot easier to see what went wrong. Back on my website, I've noticed a bug though. My page isn't giving the correct total to my visitors. Not the greatest experience for sure. So I'll switch back to Visual Studio and make a code change to try and fix it. I'll then commit and push to Bitbucket and switch back to the OnCheckin deployment manager to watch it do its work. The service actively checks your source control every 90 seconds looking for changes. When it finds them, it will automatically start a deployment for you. You can now see that the service has noticed I've checked into my source control and has queued my project for deployment again to push up any changes. The same process will be followed every time you check into either your source control directory that you pointed the service at, or for Git repositories whenever you commit to the master branch. Once OnCheckin has completed deployment for my site, we can switch back to it and check that my bug fix was successful. Awesomely, my site can now successfully count. Time to get busy with my next product feature. So far you've seen me set up automated deployments, review any build, unit test and security scan information, and then fix and deploy a bug with OnCheckin automatically. OnCheckin is a great service and we're looking to add many new exciting features in the future. You can get started today by signing up on our website.